Good evening, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon for those from other parts of the world. Welcome to the 9th MaMa Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies lecture series. The theme of the series this year is A Monkey Jumps and Britain Awakens the Mahayana, Aspects of the Westward Spread of Chinese Buddhism. Today's lecture is the third and also the last one in the series, and we are very happy and honored to have invited Professor T.H. Barrett again to share with us his insight and wisdom. The topic for today's lecture is the story of the awakening of faith across 3 continents. Before the lecture begins, I'd like to invite Dr. Pooh from our center to introduce Professor Barrett. Dr. Pooh, please.
Hello all, see you again. Good evening and good morning, depending on where you are. And yes, welcome to the last lecture of this series. In this lecture, the professor is going to share his discovery of a work that has triggered the interest of those who are outside of university environment in Britain. So please welcome Professor Tim Barrett.
Thank you very much. I've called this the story of the awakening of faith across 3 continents, but because for the past couple of years I've been sat here in England, obviously the story is going to concentrate to some extent on Europe and Britain in particular. Now, in my last lecture, I presented a quick sketch of the study of Chinese Buddhist texts by British academics, laying the emphasis on the connections between this pattern of study and British Indology, which has long been recognized as marked by a pragmatic bent, not unconnected with Britain's imperial involvement in South Asia. Edward Said, for example, in his classic depiction of Orientalism, quotes a French scholar of the imperial era who remarked at the time that Britain's political interest in India kept its studies of the area tied to concrete realities, whereas, and I quote, France seeks out the human mind as it manifests itself in India, in the same way that it is interested in China. So in accounting for the relative insignificance of the study of Chinese Buddhism before Stanley Weinstein, there are, of course, some other factors that should be kept under consideration. For example, the obvious truth that all the 19th and early 20th century figures I mentioned in my survey entirely lacked any academic training in even the most basic Chinese studies at all. The first translator of Chinese Buddhist texts to have formal university training in the Chinese language, albeit briefly, was John Blofeld, who studied at SOAS. But both he and R.H. Blythe sustained their lives in Buddhist countries by teaching English literature, not by developing teaching about East Asia for Anglophone students. But it would be misleading to suggest that until the 20th century, interest in Chinese Buddhism was entirely subsidiary to concerns about the British Raj. It is possible to compose a fuller picture. And in Chinese, such an account already exists in a very helpful survey of Western writing on Chinese religious sources up to 1911. One of the scholars I mentioned in my last lecture as a translator of Chinese accounts of India, Samuel Beale, did, as it happens, produce a good number of Buddhist translations from Chinese that are based on texts originally produced in South Asian languages. But though Beale takes due cognizance of this background, his main motive seems to have been the rendering into English of works well regarded amongst the Chinese populations he encountered, rather than the reconstruction from Chinese sources of the religious life of ancient India. He also seems to have been the only Anglophone person working in the field of Chinese Buddhism at the time, who paid more than passing attention to the text known as the Awakening of Faith, Pa Sheng Qi Xin Lun. Today, if one consults a standard source such as Wikipedia on this famous source, we find that its composition, though attributed to the poet Ashvaghosha, who seems to have lived about 80 to 150 in the Common Era, is now usually seen as purely Chinese, with the attribution of its translation to Paramartha, the great Indian translator who lived from 499 to 569. That's also seen to be as erroneous. And the second version of the text, under the name of Shikshananda, who lived 652 to 710, is regarded as a rewriting rather than a translation. And these reassessments actually reflect doubts that in some circles go right back actually to soon after the appearance of the work in 6th century China. But they were not widely heard before the 20th century, and so they were unknown to Samuel Beal. Instead, the Reverend Professor took the interpretation of this famous text off in an entirely different direction that was to bemuse the Anglophone world for almost 80 years. It was this misadventure that I hope to illuminate today. Though, as I say, because of the way we're all confined in our ability to travel, it's mainly concerned with Britain rather than what happened in East Asia or North America. And I've derived great benefit in putting together these remarks from a succinct survey by Jason Clower, who teaches in Chico State in California, which is available online through Oxford Bibliographies on Buddhism. And while I'm generally in great agreement with his assessments, I've mainly made it my task simply to probe a little further into the circumstances surrounding the production of the relevant writings. One day, perhaps someone living in better times may be able to provide a more comprehensive investigation. I've not really, for example, looked at different versions from the point of view of translation studies, going through line by line. As I say, I'm more interested as a historian in the circumstances that produce these translations. Even so, my hope is that the one corner of the problem lifted here may suffice to draw attention to aspects of the spread of Buddhism which were hinted at but not fully explained in my earlier historical sketch. The passage that started the story may be found in a little survey of 1884 on Chinese Buddhism that Beal wrote for the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which is a well-known charity dating back in England to the end of the 17th century. And in Victorian Britain, it had launched a series called Non-Christian Religious Systems, which is described as a series of manuals which furnish in a brief and popular form an accurate account of the great non-Christian religious systems of the world, a sort of down-market version of the better-known translation series, Sacred Books of the East. On the topic of Ashvaghosha, Beal states that his writings still survive in a Chinese form, and when examined, will probably be found to be much tinged with a pseudo-Christian element. In particular, he continues, there is one book, the Qi Xin Lun, or Treatise for Awakening Faith, which has never yet been properly examined, but so far as is known, is based on doctrines foreign to Buddhism and allied to a perverted form of Christian dogma. he concludes that, quote, a fusion of foreign religious doctrines took place when the Christian dogma and ritual were first carried to the East by the apostles and their successors. Wow, frankly. Now, though his remarks here on the awakening of faith are novel, his explanation of the book's supposedly Christian background actually draws on ideas already long discussed in Europe. In fact, we need to go back in the first instance to the Renaissance and Reformation in the 16th century and to the first Catholic missions of that period to Asia. As Urs Up notes, the outward similarities that the Catholic clergy discovered with their Buddhist counterparts proved disconcerting from the start, swiftly prompting talk of diabolical imitation. In some of his early writing, the great Matteo Ricci, who lived from 1552 to 1610, seems to have picked up this theme and to have suggested that the envoys sent by the Han Emperor to the West to import the true faith were actually heading for Judea, but unfortunately stopped at India and picked up Buddhism instead of Christianity. But more optimistically, he also ventured to suggest that in India, the apostle St. Thomas, or perhaps another apostle, St. Bartholomew, had introduced a Christianity that had influenced Buddhism in the form that it was imported to China. And by the end of the 17th century, according to this speculative scenario, St. Thomas was alleged by some missionaries to have come to China himself. This may seem unfortunate, but we will recall that the notion that Buddhism was a debased form of something else, namely Taoism, thanks to Lao Tzu's travels to India, a tale which we touched upon already last week in describing, well, the first week actually, describing Lao Tzu's adventures with his zombie assistant, had equally excited Chinese imaginations long before this point. But while Roman Catholic missionaries continued to have to struggle with the outward similarities of Buddhist observances with those of their own church, especially as we have noticed already in Tibet, to Protestants the matter was of little consequence. Take, for example, the book Purchas His Pilgrims of the translator Samuel Purchas, who lived from about 1575 to 1626. He was the first to introduce the writings of Matteo Ricci in English in 1625. A close study of his extensively edited translation has shown not simply that material putting a Jesuit point of view has been edited out. Remember that Catholics are the enemy in early 17th century Britain. One had tried to blow up Parliament, for example. So all that Jesuit stuff is edited out. But also, Ricci's remarks on the outward similarities between the observances of Buddhism and of his own religion have been pointed up with a rather British editorial insertion, quote, "The rites of this profane sect have great affinity with our Romish ecclesiastical." Now, Protestant distaste for elaborate ritual easily led to condemnation of China as all too reminiscent of the old enemy, France. Thus, Lord Macartney, 1737 to 1806, who was first British ambassador to China, concludes, "The paraphernalia of religion displayed here, the altars, images, tabernacles, censers, lamps, candles, and candlesticks, with the sanctimonious deportment of the priests and the solemnity used in the celebration of their mysteries, have no small resemblance to the holy mummeries of the Romish Church, as practiced in those countries where it is rich and powerful. It is true that Tibet offered the most obvious opportunity to poke fun at Catholics. The one-time romantic rebel Robert Southey, 1774 to 1843, whose later switch to supporting the establishment saw him end up as a poet laureate and a strong opponent of Catholic emancipation. Catholics were under restrictions. They couldn't, for example, go to Oxford or Cambridge at the beginning of the 19th century. In a work of 1826, Southey clearly enjoys greatly the Anglican sport of referring, for example, to the Pope of Tibet and the Dalai Lama of Rome. But China also gave enough pretext for this sort of patriotic British game. Sir John Francis Davis, first governor of Hong Kong, for example, 1795 to 1890, writing in 1836, states that, again, the mummeries of Buddhists are a parallel to the worst parts of Roman Catholicism, and turning the genetic argument for their similarity around very neatly. To those who admit that most of the Romish ceremonies and rites are borrowed directly from paganism, there is less difficulty in accounting for the resemblance. End of quote. In short, who cares where St. Thomas went, since the upshot was that both sides became corrupt. Corruption, too, gets a different but equally forthright treatment 2 years later in the pages of the British missionary Charles Gutzlaff. In earlier life, the Pomeranian Karl Friedrich August Gutzlaff, in his remarks on those he calls the, quote, shamanists, who are virtually the same with the Buddhists, or indeed, actually identical, since by shaman he means shaman, shramana, the mendicant renunciant of the Buddhist tradition in China. And this is Gutzlaff, as he called himself, had to say. For many of their rites, they are indebted to the depraved Nestorian Christians who had found their way into Central Asia. The great resemblance to the superstitions of popery, which was so universally spread during the Middle Ages, induces us to think that the absurdities of shamanism in Tibet received their present form during the 11th and 12th centuries of our era. The dress of the lamas, their beads, missals, vespers, mass, cloisters, nunneries, priests with shaven heads, celibacy, etc., strike even the most superficial observer as very similar to the institutions of the Romish Church. The comparison itself naturally becomes part of the stock-in-trade of later British Protestant missionary writing, and further examples are not hard to find in the late 19th century as superficial observers multiplied. Explanations for the phenomenon observed, however, did not multiply, but tended to follow precedent. The American missionary Justice Doolittle, who's 1824 to 1880, after engagingly describing the similarities that would have been observed, not by scholars, but by the common people of China, in his words, summarized the possible causes very succinctly for his colleagues, referring to a couple of French missionary, Catholic missionary authorities. Hooke, the Lazarist, he says, seems pleased with this striking similarity and says, Buddhism has an admixture of truth with the Holy Church. Premar, another distinguished Romanist, says, the devil has imitated Mother Church to scandalize her. Protestants ask, has not Romanism borrowed from paganism? Well, to concede that the devil has decided to target the Church of Rome, of course, would have been to admit that it had an importance deserving such diabolical attentions, which perhaps, if they'd thought about it, Protestants would have been reluctant to do. On the other hand, one might have expected the genetic approach to have faded as the religious history of Asia and of the Buddhist tradition in particular became clearer in the course of the 19th century. But it was a religious history rather too useful to be abandoned in a hurry. We find, therefore, John Henry Gray, 1823 to 1890, first Archdeacon of Hong Kong, perfectly willing in 1878 to write, quote, "It has been remarked that Buddhism, especially Lamaism, has many external points of resemblance to Roman Catholicism. The many Christian forms and ceremonies which were pressed into the service of paganism by the priests of Tibet were probably derived from Nestorian and Roman Catholic missionaries who labored in Central Asia." End of quote. After, however, recounting the same litany of similarities as his many predecessors, he does own up that, quote, "he is unable to speak with certainty on all these points." And he explains in conclusion, "From Tibet, many of these ceremonies found their way into China, but they are much less numerous in the cultus of the Buddhist priests of the empire than in that of the lamas of Tibet, Mongolia, and Manchuria." End quote. It will be noticed that in returning to the possible influence of the Church of the East in China, Archdeacon Gray is much more civil than Gutzlaff, and he avoids accusations of depravity. And there may well be a reason for this, it occurs to me. Michael Kivac has shown in his extended examination of the reception history of the Tang period Christian stele of Xi'an that for a long time after its early 17th century discovery, its reputation was clouded, especially in Protestant circles, by the suspicion that it might be a Jesuit fake. Such doubts began to wane in the middle of the 19th century, and in particular, after the Scottish Presbyterian missionary Alexander Williamson, 1829 to 1890, was able to examine the object himself. It's real. Beale doesn't mention the inscription, which does provide solid, tangible evidence with other sources for the presence of Christianity in 7th and 8th century China. But he does speculate at some length about early Christian influence in India, since a King Gondophares, mentioned in tales about St. Thomas, had at the time he was writing recently been attested at about the right time in Indian history by numismatic evidence. So, in this way, the awakening of faith had been identified as a crypto-Christian text in a well-known English language account of Buddhism in China, with no descent that we know of from the Chinese Buddhist community at that point. In Japan, however, writers were beginning to emerge who could debate Western ideas about Buddhism in English on the basis of a wide knowledge of Chinese sources, even if, as we noted in the last lecture, their absorption of Western Indological knowledge was only at an early stage. I mentioned Nanzhou Bunyan, for example. Now, the career of D.T. Suzuki as one of the leaders in the West of Eastern Buddhism, as it was termed, is well known, and much attention has been given to his background in Meiji Japan and his formative years in the United States. Judith Snodgrass notes how Suzuki, as a disciple of the Zen master Shakusoin, very prominent figure, lived 1859 to 1919, because he was a disciple of Soen, he was soon involved as an amanuensis. I'm not sure, Soen may have had some English, but Suzuki's English was better. So he's brought in exchanges with an American clergyman, the Reverend F.F. Ellinwood, 1826 to 1908, concerning the status of Mahayana Buddhism. Recall, because of the imperial and colonial connections of the British, Pali language Buddhism is seen as the original and best. Anyhow, the Japanese were now trying to argue for Mahayana Buddhism. Ellinwood repeats the normal line concerning Eastern Buddhism, but he says it in this way, that it, quote, comes nearer to the doctrine of the Apostle Paul than Shakyamuni, end quote. And he concludes, well, this is not his conclusion, this is Judith Snodgrass' conclusions. In other words, any positive conceptions present in Eastern Buddhism were the result of contact with Christianity. On Suzuki's arrival in the USA, he set to work, therefore, under his American patron and publisher, Paul Carus, interesting figure, 1852 to 1919. Suzuki was helping him with things like translations of the Tao Te Ching and so forth. Carus was a broad-minded man originally from Germany who had ended up in the middle of the United States. Anyhow, Suzuki set out to produce a work that would show the benefits of using Chinese sources for Indological research, and also to demonstrate that Mahayana Buddhist philosophical thought was well established at an early date. That is precisely what his translation of the second Chinese version of The Awakening of Faith achieves, showing what an abundance of information about the life and times of Ashvaghosha may be gleaned from Chinese works, which situate him in the 1st century CE at the latest. But no grounds are found for bringing in any apostles. And the focus is much more on the Buddhist king Kanishka. That done, he turns explicitly to Beale, beginning, quote, I cannot help saying a few words here about the importance of Ashvaghosha's main work, which is scarcely known in the West, and if so, wrongly. Even Samuel Beale, who is considered one of the best authorities on Chinese Buddhism, makes a misleading reference to our author in his Buddhism in China as evidence that, quote, he had a very insufficient knowledge of the subject, end quote. Suzuki gives us Beale's sentence describing the contents of The Awakening of Faith as you recall, a perverted form of Christian dogma. And he rounds this off by saying, quote, the incorrectness of this statement will be readily seen by the reader when we proceed further on. In other words, read my translation and you'll see there's really no Christianity here. Now, Suzuki's writings in general have been reprinted incessantly throughout the 20th century. A remark about The Awakening of Faith in a footnote in his first series of essays of 1927 has therefore appeared several times in their post-war guise, and I think it's been reprinted perhaps even in the 21st century. So a lot of Suzuki has been in print for a lot of the time, but he never returned to this early translation. And the reasons for this may perhaps be discerned already in his 1932 translation of the Lankavatara Sutra, entitled The Lankavatara Sutra, a Mahayana text, where he quietly concedes that the traditional ascription of the Awakening of Faith may be wrong, while on the other hand, describing the suspicion that it was composed in China as, quote, not well grounded, end quote. and this continues in a post-war book from the 1940s, The Zen Doctrine of No Mind. He simply says about the awakening of faith, usually ascribed to Ashwagosha. Well, the origins of the text are indeed problematic and complex. And in his later years, he cannot be blamed for not hurling himself into the very complex arguments involved. Unfortunately, however, someone else had read Beale's remarks with very different consequences, namely the Welsh Baptist missionary Timothy Richard, 1845 to 1919. His work as the first British translator of The Awakening of Faith has been examined in a pioneering study by Francesca Torocco that also adds some remarks on Suzuki. So here I do not attempt to improve upon her findings. Richard had first become aware of the importance of the text in 1884 through a meeting with Yang Wenhui, 1837 to 1911, the famous Buddhist layman and friend from his time as a diplomat in England of Nanjo Bunyu, whom we mentioned last week. Yang was a great promoter of the treatise, The Awakening of Faith. And by the missionary's own account in the preface to his translation, he was the one who set Richard to reading a copy, which immediately impressed the Welshman with its Christian overtones. And he goes on, 3 months later, I was in a bookseller's shop in Edinburgh, and looking through his new books, I came across Beale's little book on Buddhism, then just published. Turning up a certain chapter in it, I found that he referred to The Awakening of Faith as a pseudo-Christian book, which it was desirable to have translated, ! He accordingly, on his return to China and meeting Yang again, engaged him to assist in reading. Obviously, the text was written in a style that no dictionary could help him with. And indeed, no ordinary Confucian scholar could probably advise him on either. By 1894, the deed was done, though not with any intimation to Yang of the very Christian tenor of Richard's interpretation. And when Richard eventually found time to publish it in Shanghai in 1907, with Yang listed on the title page as having helped, Yang Wenhui was understandably not best pleased at all. Well, the English language press of Shanghai was vibrant, but its impact in the wider Anglophone world was not massive. In 1910, however, Richard published as The New Testament of Higher Buddhism, I have it here, an expanded version, which lacks Yang's name on the title page. The simplest way to deal with that problem is simply ignore him. And it has some additional material in it, such as a synopsis of the Lotus Sutra, which takes the same line about Christianity. And he put it out through T&T Clark of Edinburgh, who were then and still are a well-respected publisher of theological and other works. And this is the edition that had the wider impact, though the introductory material retains much of the same content. In particular, it's made quite explicit that the publication of the 1894 draft translation was made necessary by the appearance of Suzuki's book. He draws explicitly on Suzuki's research for the details of the life of the supposed author of the original treatise, which was, of course, based on a reading of Chinese sources that would have been beyond him. But he objects to Suzuki's overall approach. And this turns up first at the start of the general introduction, where the Japanese scholar is flatly contradicted. And again, later, after the account of meeting Owen Hui, he is attacked equally bluntly. Quote, in Suzuki's introduction, he quotes a large number of different authorities about Ashwagosha. But as he approaches the subject from the non-Christian point of view, the light of which comes from a comparison between it and Christianity, is denied him. So Suzuki misunderstood because he's not a Christian. Yet the Christianity Richard propounds is slightly unexpected. There are no decadent Nestorians here. And even St. Thomas has only put in a brief appearance as a possible influence. This is how he puts it. Where Ashwagosha got his ideas, we do not know. Some say from the Apostle Thomas, who is supposed to have been with him in the court of Gondopharos or Kanishka. But we await further light on the historic meeting place of Christianity and New Buddhism. End of quote. In fact, though his attack on Suzuki looks like straightforward polemics, reading a little further, the matter becomes more complex. 2 pages after dealing with his Japanese rival, we find a section entitled, quote, Common Origin Around Babylon, end quote, that strikes a more ambiguous note, and this is what it says. It is getting clearer each year now that those common doctrines of New Buddhism and Christianity were not borrowed from one another, but that both came from a common source, Babylonia. So, not only that, but after bringing in Babylonia, he goes on to say, and this is his conclusion, as it were, quote, it is also getting clearer each year that different truths, wherever found, cannot be antagonistic. They do not neutralize, but complement each other. They do not destroy, but fulfill one another. End of quote. This, in short, is something new to both Christianity and Buddhism. Some seem swiftly to have found the message welcome. In 1912, William Gemmell of Glasgow produced a translation of the Diamond Sutra that quotes approvingly as a famous Buddhist tract, The Awakening of Faith by Ashwagosha, quote, who flourished AD 50 under the Indo-Scythic king Gondophares. And that also commends Timothy Richard for translating the Chinese term for Tathagata as he did, God. So some people like that. It's a bit odd because Gemmell, as far as I've been able to find out, appears to have been originally a China inland missionary, and they were generally theologically rather conservative. But already didn't need the China Inland Mission. Already in 1908, the Anglican Bishop of Mid-China, G.E. Moule, based in Hangzhou, 1828 to 1912, he'd already expressed strong misgivings about a publication that seemed to set at naught basic Christian doctrines such as the crucifixion. And Richard's biographer, William Suttle, who we mentioned last week, is obliged to express himself very carefully on the topic of his friend's orthodoxy. In his book, Timothy Richard of China, he sees Richard as actually ultimately stressing the link with the Nestorians, and he concludes, listen carefully, Richard's contribution to the study of Buddhism may be described as more valuable for its suggestiveness than for its literal accuracy. I think I might have to translate that for you. It's a polite English way of saying, on this topic, the man was an idiot. Perhaps the best that can be said is that Richard's efforts at Buddhist translation were not as bad as his attempt at showing that the story of the Monkey King was also a crypto-Christian text. For while I have suggested that this superb simian story did have a complex background, whatever it wasn't that. In fact, Richards left the awakening of faith dangerously suspended in a sort of religious no man's land, a prize for any free-spirited pilgrim of the imagination. Even Suzuki's impeccably Buddhist version was probably not helped by the preface from Paul Carus, which adduces in explaining suchness, general. Carus equates it with Plato's realm of ideas. No wonder, perhaps, that the second translation to be undertaken in America of the Awakening of Faith, while criticizing its predecessors, ignores the New Testament of higher Buddhism entirely. This was a version included by Dwight Goddard, 1861 to 1939, that appears in the first expanded edition of his famous A Buddhist Bible, which was self-published in Thetford, Vermont in 1938. And it looks like that. I do not propose to say much about this undertaking, since though Goddard is mentioned in sources on American Buddhism, they say very little about his co-translator, Bai Dao, whose support was clearly crucial, given that though Goddard had been a missionary in China at one point, he apparently did not have the capacity to translate Buddhist Chinese unaided. Well, now Goddard certainly knew Suzuki. He'd met the Zen master. Well, he met another Zen master actually first. He met the Zen master who was the future husband of Ruth Fuller Suzuki, who we mentioned last week. This man, Soke-an, was in New York in 1928. And after Goddard met him, this inspired him to travel to Japan to meet Suzuki in person and to study his writings, including his 1900 translation. He published a bit on this, but I really need to look at that in more detail before I say more. So, I mean, one consequence is that he's more careful about talking about the authorship of the Awakening of Faith than Suzuki had been in 1900, at any rate. For in the bibliographic appendix to the Buddhist Bible, the note on the text states only that it is, quote, generally credited to the great Indian poet and controversialist Ashwagosha, unquote. He doesn't commit himself entirely. But he's also surprisingly unenthusiastic about Suzuki's translation, because he goes on, there have been 2 English translations of note. Dr. Suzuki's, made in 1900 and now long out of print. This was marred by too great an interpretation of it as a metaphysical treatise, end quote. I can only suppose, given that he states in the note that he and Wai Dao made their translation in 1936 and 1937, when the war of resistance against Japan was just getting underway, that Wai Dao was a patriot who saw Japanese Buddhists as, if I can put it this way, better at theory than practice. But as it happens, Mrs. Suzuki was in turn not very polite about Goddard's edition in his Bible. She's talking about Chan text, so she doesn't mention Awakening of Faith, but she does pick up his edition of the Platform Sutra, which is based on the original translation that was done in Shanghai in 1930. And she says, this version of the translation suffers from the editor's limited knowledge of the Chinese language and his dependence upon personal intuition. rather than scholarship. It cannot be used as a text for the serious study of Zen, which put him in his place, I suppose. But what Goddard says about the second translation known to him is, as I have now discovered, very significantly inaccurate. This is what he says. Another was made by several Sanskrit scholars from a Sanskrit text remade from the Chinese, and misses the profound esoteric significance of the original. This was published in the magazine The Shrine of Wisdom in 1929 and 1930. Now, the Shrine of Wisdom still exists as the publishing arm of what is now known as the Finchley Trust of Brook, near Godalming, Surrey. And thanks to the kindness of the current administrator and librarian, I was able to visit the trust in September 2021 and consult archives relevant to the translation, and to secure copies of the magazine that Goddard refers to. Presumably, what he is saying is that the several Sanskrit scholars had some knowledge of Chinese and used it to hypothesize the original Sanskrit from which the awakening of faith had been translated, after which they rendered that reconstruction into English. This was simply not the case at all, nor does anything in the four-part magazine translation of 1929 to 1930. This is the magazine, The Shrine of Wisdom. There's I've looked through every part of the translation. There's nothing to remotely suggest that this is based on a reconstruction into Sanskrit. But of course, both the editors of the Shrine of Wisdom and Goddard and Weidao include Sanskrit words like karma, dharma, bodhisattva, and so forth in their translations. Very common practice because, as I've stressed, Indological awareness of Buddhism surpassed any familiarity with Buddhist Chinese. And as it happens for this period, as much in North America as in the United Kingdom. So this was a common practice, but doesn't mean that the text as a whole was being reconstruction. North America actually is involved, although Godalming is really very English. The translation actually may not have been done there. Wasn't done there, I think. Probably done in the reading room of the British Museum. But anyhow, the translation was the work of an American who had already achieved remarkable distinction. He was famous in the field of photography. I mean, he's a major figure in the history of art photography in the early 20th century. His name is Alvin Langdon Coburn, 1882 to 1966. And assisting him was his wife, Edith Whiteman Coburn, 1880 to 1957. He doesn't, in his autobiography, talk about the translation, but he devotes a chapter to the inner life, as he calls it. And it begins, in October 1923, I met a great and good man who influenced my life more profoundly and changed it more completely than any other person I have ever known. And I am deeply grateful to divine providence for having placed this supreme experience in my path. And he tells how their first meeting was extended by a lengthy conversation in a Chinese restaurant in London. The Finchley Trust is connected, as their website makes clear, and I do commend their website to you. It's for photographs of what is actually a rather beautiful place. It's connected to an international group known as the Universal Order. But the Universal Order group prefers a measure of anonymity rather than any cult of personality. So the great and good man is not named either by Coburn here or indeed on the website. The balance of the chapter, however, is devoted to D.T. Suzuki, whom Coburn had met in London in 1936, when Suzuki was visiting the World Congress of Faiths. This is actually an organization founded by Sir Francis Younghusband, and it was a great fortnight-long public meeting of international religious leaders gathering from around the world. Now, you'll recall Younghusband from the last lecture as the bloodthirsty invader of Tibet. But fortunately, after this unpleasant expedition, he had a change of heart and thereafter pursued the paths of peace, or at least spirituality, for the remainder of his life. The archives of the Fintry Trust preserve 6 letters from Suzuki to Coburn, relating to a notable photograph that Coburn took of Suzuki at this point. His eyebrows come out very well in it. Congdon's autobiography shows a keen appreciation of Chinese thought and food, but this by no means marked the limit of his enthusiasms. In 1935, for example, he became a lay reader in the Church of Wales after having become a British citizen in 1932. So the translation in the Shrine of Wisdom magazine is preceded in the first part of it by an editorial preface introducing the supposed author on the basis of Suzuki's biographical research in Chinese sources, and also naming the first 2 translations, but without comment, beyond saying that they're out of print. And then it goes on to say, the present free and interpretive translation is by the editors of the Shrine of Wisdom. A couple of pages of explanations of some of the terminology represented by Sanskrit in the translation follows. In one case, noting that Buddha Tathagata is the Godhead considered from the metaphysical aspect, and that this term may have been translated by Suzuki as suchness, and by Richards as true form, but, quote, it's been thought advisable to use the original Sanskrit word. Now, you may have suspected that this is just like some alleged translations of the Tao Te Ching, that this is just a rehash of stuff already in English. But the evidence that the translation was based on a quite laborious reading of the Chinese text by the Congdons is found in various, what's his name, not Congdon. It's Coburn, isn't it? Langdon Coburn. It's found in various notebooks on Chinese vocabulary preserved by the Fintry Trust. And also, and this surprised me, a copy of a very unusual edition of the Timothy Richard translation, produced by the Methodist Publishing House in Shanghai in 1918, never found any reference to this anywhere else, which appends, as part of its publication, an edition of the Chinese text, one that was originally published in Japan in 1888 by Fuji Genju, 1812 to 1895, and entitled Daijo Kishinron Kochu, edited and annotated, and Awakening of Faith. Not much annotation. The Fintry Trust also preserves a copy of Herbert Giles's Chinese English Dictionary of 1892, which would have been the largest such work available at the time. But unfortunately, as we noted in the last lecture, and I quite deliberately drew attention to this, Giles is not always good at understanding Buddhist material. And this dictionary is available online, and you can see for yourself that he does, for example, correctly equate Chan with Sanskrit jhana. But some of the phrases that he then collects under that headword are not really glossed at all accurately. So you can't really use it reliably as a Buddhist dictionary. Now, file 296 at the Fintry Trust contains correspondence suggesting that the editors intended to improve upon their efforts from quite early on. And not all this correspondence is dated, but it seems that by 1944 at the latest, those intended revisions had come to involve A.F. Price and other members of the editorial team. Arnold F. Price is best known for his translation of the Diamond Sutra, originally published by the Buddhist Society in London in 1947, with a preface by W.Y. Evans Wentz, 1878 to 1965. And this translation has reached an even wider readership. The Buddhist Society, I think, did reprint it, but their publications don't circulate particularly widely. But it was then republished and has been widely read since 1969, when it was combined with the Buddhist Society, another Buddhist Society work, their 1953 republication of the Platform Sutra, a re-edition of the 1930 original English translation. So these two were put together in 1969 in North America by Shambhala, who were then in Berkeley. And ever since, this popular combination of works has been reprinted repeatedly into the 21st century. Well, meanwhile, as Goddard's version, that doesn't have a version of the Awakening of Faith. It's the Platform Sutra of the Diamond, but the Diamond was produced by somebody associated with the Shrine of Wisdom. And eventually, the revised version of the Awakening Faith was published as a slim volume by the Shrine of Wisdom in 1964. Slim. And a cursory inspection, when you check it against the 4-part magazine original publication, shows that while there are some excisions, for example, there's a shortening of the biography of Ashvaghosha, and there's a removal of the discussion of how Suzuki and Richard translate key words. The new edition is most significantly marked by expansion, chiefly in the form of you ending up in East Asia, and on the meaning of nirvana. Now, unfortunately, a letter dated 20th November 1931, which is still at the Fintry Trust, from E.H. Johnston, who states that 1885 to 1942, who at that point was soon to be Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford. This letter, which they had, was overlooked, for it's in fact a response to a question about Ashvaghosha, and Johnston was an Indologist who'd done a lot of work on Ashwaghosh's writings, and he writes, "The awakening of faith is almost certainly not his. It is a Mahayana work of great interest, written perhaps 2 centuries later." Johnson, of course, is writing as an Indologist, but that was his opinion in 1931. Too late for the magazine issue, but this information was not incorporated into the slim volume publication. And that slim volume publication is still available from the Trust, along with almost a score of other short works. And these, if you look at them at the whole, along with the content of the Shrine of Wisdom periodical, give a good conspectus of the interests of the editors. Several translations, for example, derive from Taoist works, like the Classic of Purity, Jing Jing Jing, which was first published as a 7-page pamphlet in 1934, and this one's reprinted in 1980. So if you look at, as it were, where they're coming from, rather than displaying anything of the late 19th century preoccupation with Nestorian influences on Buddhism, the main Western tradition that's represented in their works is Neoplatonism, often through edited excerpts from the work of Thomas Taylor, 1758 to 1835, who was an unusually diligent and influential translator of the relevant Greek materials. Wikipedia says that he and his wife spoke to each other exclusively in classical Greek. It says, so what's all this about? Well, we may recall that Plato imagined an ideal world beyond our immediate senses. And just to cut a rather long story short, his thought was then taken up in the early centuries of the Common Era by a number of thinkers, Plotinus, Porphyry, and so on, who adapted his approach to the religious environment of the age, and apparently with some awareness of non-European beliefs. Certainly, they looked to the East to some extent, though in the view of at least one contemporary Buddhist, Stephen Batchelor, they didn't actually incorporate what could be called Buddhist influence. It's not a matter I'd wish to pronounce on. With the waning of the Middle Ages, a revived interest in this tradition had emerged in Italy in the 15th and 16th century, as I suppose the rigidity of Western European thought now required some flexibility to cope with the wider intellectual perspectives that were dawning, with exploration and so forth to start with. One trend that achieved this end of more flexibility was an interest in Psychotheologia, the ancient theology, which drew on materials apparently compatible with Christianity that were attributed to remote antiquity. And the Jesuit missions to China exploited this trend in trying to locate a long-lost monotheism in the Chinese past that might be reconciled with their own efforts at converting the adherents of Confucius. But another label that emerged in the 16th century, which really was more closely tied to Neoplatonism, was Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy, meaning the wisdom of the ages that was the common heritage of mankind. And this notion seems to be very popular with those leaning towards Neoplatonist thought. Late 17th century Britain showed an interest in these ideas too, especially in Cambridge. And these Cambridge people were still recalled by those in the early 19th century who were beginning to engage at that point, engage seriously with Asian thought. In some recent work, I've come across a couple of references to a Cambridge Neoplatonist in the early 19th century, who's the 17th century, but his work is referred back to in the early 19th. And meanwhile, of course, Thomas Taylor's writings by the late 18th, early 19th century are having a less than obvious, perhaps, but still considerable impact on the great literary figures of the Romantic period, the Coleridges and so forth. So, given this background, in more recent times, the combination of a high regard for Neoplatonism with the openness to Asian religion that we find in the Shrine of Wisdom publications, what shall we say about this? Well, it would no doubt have delighted Paul Carus, though maybe that Bishop G.E. Moore may have taken more persuading. And in fact, this combination of Neoplatonic and Asian interests was quite widespread in the 20th century Anglophone world, if you look around. In 1945, Aldous Huxley, who states that 1894 to 1963, his passing was, alas, not observed particularly widely at the time, not because he is an insignificant figure, but because he happened to die on the same day that President Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Aldous Huxley had been British by origin, related to a very famous British intellectual family, mainly scientists, but I did have a colleague related to the Huxley family who in SOAS, who was an expert on Buddhist law, for example. Aldous Huxley, best known, I think, as a novelist, had been living in the USA since 1937, and he published a substantial anthology under the very title, The Perennial Philosophy. That became a very widely read source of information for a popular readership on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. And in the antepenultimate chapter of this famous volume, he includes a quotation of Ashvaghosha, which runs to over 3 pages straight. And it's taken from The Awakening of Faith in Goddard's Buddhist Bible. People interested in the Awakening of Faith, but are writing in the same mode, didn't always use the Buddhist Bible. W.Y. Evans Wentz, who I mentioned earlier, his Tibetan Book of the Dead, very famous work, naturally features, along with some of his other writings, in Huxley's bibliography. And he is certainly aware of the Buddhist Bible. He mentions it, I think, somewhere in one of his works. But when he refers to the Awakening of Faith, he cites both the Suzuki and the Richard versions, plus, of course, lots of Neoplatonism. And this, for example, is in not in the Book of the Dead, but in another one of his publications called The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. I think there's about 9 references in the footnotes to the Awakening of Faith in one version or another. Given the standing of Evans Wentz in Buddhist studies, especially with regard to Tibet, Don Lopez Jr. Has been at pains to point out that his religious background was originally in theosophy, and that he was, if I can put it this way, summing up the information that Don Lopez gives, shall we say, more of an impresario of translation than a translator. I hope that's fair. Writers such as these, however, certainly will have generated some curiosity about a spiritual classic not to be readily found in English, other than as buried in Goddard's Bible, which was reprinted in the 1950s in North America and in Britain. So in view, however, of the limited distribution of the Shrine of Wisdom, it's no surprise that an Englishman in the 1960s, while not attempting to address the original Chinese texts, should have hit upon the idea of updating the Richard version to make it more palatable to the readership of his day. This is an individual who's a little bit elusive, but I'm thinking maybe he published a very slim volume of poetry early in his career. I think maybe I'll buy a copy and see what he was up to as a poet. But mostly he gave up on poetry. This is someone called Alan Howell Walton, 1917 to 1989. And he produced his edited Awakening of Faith in London in 1961. Where is it? So apparently somebody's republished this in India and has copies for sale. But Howell Walton is described by Jason Clower in this sort of overview of translations of the Awakening Faith succinctly as, quote, a writer on erotica, end quote. Well, true, his publisher in the case of the Awakening of Faith, Charles Skilton, I don't know if it's not on the cover, but anyhow, that's the title page. Charles Skilton. The publisher turns out, according to information on the internet, to have been an engaging fellow who made his money from selling postcards of London life, supplemented by his Luxor press, who were purveyors of the mild pornography permissible in those days. But the dust jacket of my copy conveys a self-image that does not mention this at all. And this is what it says. Alan Howell Walton was born in 1917 in Northumberland and educated at the Royal Grammar School and Durham University. Before settling in a flat overlooking Hampstead Heath, he travelled extensively and visited France for lengthy periods. Described by one critic as a medieval scholar set down in the present day, he possesses a library of over 6,000 volumes. He first came to notice during 1941, when his translations from the poetry of Baudelaire were well received both here and abroad. His reputation was established by works in the fields of sociology, morals, and religion. He is also an expert bibliographer. By contrast, his prominence as a writer of erotica, of necessity, seems to have become established, for the most part, after 1961, with the relaxation of British obscenity laws after the 1960 D.H. Lawrence Lady Chatterley's Lover trial. Though, of course, earlier than this, he could have been writing under a pseudonym. But, you know, once things open up a bit in Britain, in 1964, he published a translation of Marquis de Sade's Justine that was soon reissued in a popular paperback series, the Corgi paperbacks. And from 1965, he seems to have started to contribute to Penthouse magazine. But in fact, a study of the liberalization of writing during this period that was published a decade or more than a decade ago points out that Howell Walton had in fact been advocating greater openness on sexual matters since 1943, though without gaining much attention. But clearly, what happened was he must have found out that sex sells better than religion does in the new climate. So apart from one translation from Dumas that was published in 1975, he appears to have kept mainly 2 works on aphrodisiacs and the like thereafter. No more perennial philosophy. I do not know how long he and his books continued to inhabit Highgate, or wherever it was, nor what may have become of them. His library does not seem to have included Goddard's Bible or the serially published Shrine of Wisdom translation. But he does mention the Suzuki version, and reading between the lines, we find his reason for ignoring this also in his subsequent account of the Richard alternative. This is what he says about the Richard translation that he's using. Quite apart from its interest for the scholar and theologian, this particular version seems admirably suited to those readers with a Christian background, yet who lack more than a slight acquaintance with Buddhist thought. In short, I think, interpreting that, Suzuki knew too much about what the text meant for the average British reader. So, that he knew that what would sell better would be the Richard version. But rescuing the Christian awakening of faith from its missionary background in late Qing China plainly involves some ruthless interventions beyond jettisoning almost all the introduction to the Richard translation. In place of the excised material, we get a completely different context for the understanding of the work. The general tenor of Hull Walton's approach is signaled already by the foreword, which is by, guess who? Aldous Huxley, dated to Los Angeles, 1960. Though it is in itself short to the point of making no observation whatsoever on the quality of the introduction or the translation, it soon becomes apparent that this guest appearance by Huxley is not merely decorative. If we go on with Hull Walton's new introduction, after a brief nod to Dr. Carl Jung of Zurich and William James, we learn, with regard to the study of religion, that, quote, Huxley, the most erudite of living writers in this field, combining the knowledge of the scientist, the perception of the psychologist, and the vision of the seer, has, in his profoundly important anthology and commentary, The Perennial Philosophy, given infinitely further ground for believing that the basis of genuine religion rests on inward experience rather than on strict adherence to orthodoxy and its outward ritual. So much for degenerate historians or whoever, or Tibetans, one would have thought. But it depends how you understand those Tibetans. So next, you do get an appearance from Evans Wentz and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then the Neoplatonist Plotinus arrives, and eventually summing up our author states, and this is, as it were, the bottom line: the one mind, the cosmic mind, the divine mind, whether of Buddhist, Neoplatonist, or Christian mystic, are, as Aldous Huxley has clearly demonstrated, one and the same. Now, this, from our contemporary perspective 60 years later, could come across as, I mean, one possible way of construing this could be to say that it is Orientalism in its purest form, perhaps something that even Timothy Richard was perhaps only groping towards. Because one way to look at this is what it is saying effectively, that you Orientals, though in fact no Asian readership is ever envisaged, you Orientals cannot understand your ancient scriptures, but we superior Westerners, with our knowledge of Greek and Christian philosophy, can sort everything out for you. I'm afraid that wouldn't be the only publication I've come across that more or less takes this point of view. And if that's what he's doing, I could go on to detail how, in order to achieve this, Hull Walton expunges all traces of the Chinese missionary background within the text, and replacing Chinese with Sanskrit, as he admits. And in fact, where he does not understand a Chinese term, he eliminates it altogether. But on the other hand, he is entirely judicious in rejecting the notion of Christian influence in the formation of the Mahayana, while somehow conceding possible later influences in Tibet. All in all, however, it was probably a good thing that in 1968, Columbia University Press published the translation by Yoshito Hakeda, who was teaching at Columbia at the time. A volume that is perhaps not entirely beyond criticism. He was a Shingon priest, and it's possible that it's slightly sectarian, but not dramatically so. And certainly it's rendered the awakening of faith into English based on an understanding of the text that draws on a considerable body of both traditional and modern Chinese and Japanese scholarship. And Hakeda commends Suzuki for his understanding of the text, though not the version he chooses to translate. And he does, well, he cites enough from Richard's introduction to show that his approach, while sympathetic, was more Christian than Buddhist. And towards Goddard and Weidao, he's more severe. Quote, "To begin with, the translation is incomplete. In addition, it is often difficult to identify the translated passages with the original. And there are many interpolations and unwarranted interpretations," end of quote. Well, being in America in 1960s, the Shrine of Wisdom translation and the Hull Walton rewriting of Richard, it doesn't know, they weren't known on the other side of the Atlantic, it seems. The likelihood that the awakening of faith could have been written by a Sanskrit poet of the 1st or 2nd century CE is flatly rejected by Hakeda. And the possibility of Chinese composition is brought forward. So we can at last bid farewell to Gondophares. And Neoplatonism too is nowhere mentioned. In the most recent translation by John Jorgensen, Dan Lusthouse, John Macomb, and Mark Strange, it has therefore been possible to move on to discuss the problematic aspects of the thought of the awakening of faith within its Chinese Buddhist context, which is fascinating, difficult, but well worth investigating. Well, to allow you some time to come back to me on all this, I sum up at this point. As I say, there are more explorations possible about these, what shall we say, proto-translations. But is there anything to be learned from this story? One conclusion might be that a translator of Buddhist works in Chinese should only work within a study well stocked, not simply with every commentary written in East Asia, but also with all the necessary resources for understanding the original text within its historical and cultural context. Maybe there is something more besides. Having to pay some attention to British studies of Tibet has obliged me to reread David Snellgrove's autobiography with some attention. And I noticed that Snellgrove, a Catholic convert and a religious man, experienced some difficulty in his relation with his teachers, who, at least the ones who read texts for exclusively linguistic reasons. So let me tie things up this way. We may or may not have a shared interest in the deeds of monkeys. We may or may not have a shared interest in the ultimate truth. But if we come from different cultures with different histories to any of these matters, we will need a disciplined process of education if we are to move beyond shared interest to shared understanding. This is what the Centre of Buddhist Studies here supports. This is what this lecture series supports. This is what, in my own way, it's been my privilege to support in these lectures too. Thank you very much. And that's how I draw to a conclusion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very inspiring lecture. So the session is now open to the floor. You're very welcome to raise your questions in the chat box, either in Zoom or in YouTube.
Okay, the role of Hong Kong in the context. Right. I think I came to that at the very end. Let me say this. I've also been working with people at the Chinese University of Hong Kong on questions of translation, mainly from, I may have mentioned this, mainly Chinese to English in the 19th century, but also earlier and later. Hong Kong, it seems to me, is or has been, we can't speak about the future, unfortunately. Hong Kong has been, has played a vital role in translation and interpretation from Chinese to Anglophone culture. I mean, none of the people that I have talked about, obviously I referred in places, for example, to an archdeacon from Hong Kong, but for the most part, the translators I've been talking about may have been based elsewhere, but for the modern understanding of their efforts, I mean, I look at things from a historical point of view, but maybe there are other ways to look at it. For the study of this process of cross-cultural contact, there is nowhere as well placed as Hong Kong. I must say, my colleague Hugh Baker, who was professor of Chinese for some time in SOAS, in his inaugural lecture, quite trenchantly spoke of the colonial regime in Hong Kong as a wasted opportunity. If we go back to Said and his interesting quotation from a French scholar, the British approach has always been pragmatic, not interested in the intellect. The French and the Germans, the Italians have schools of East Asian studies in Kyoto, or the French have a place in Hong Kong, so on and so forth. There's places like Ricci institutes and so forth. The British have done this for certain parts of the world. There was an Institute of Persian Studies at one stage. They have a school in Athens, a school in Rome. But for East Asian civilization, the East Asian civilization should be intellectually worth investigating, is something that doesn't seem to have crossed the colonial mind at all. Hugh Baker is quite scathing about the fact that education originally in Hong Kong was set up as a sort of Victorian, a facsimile of Victorian education in East Asia. Chinese studies was brought into the University of Hong Kong, partly at largely at the instigation of local Chinese who thought that this had to be counterbalanced with an assertion of traditional Chinese values, given that they felt that people who were only taught engineering might be victim to some of the awful enthusiasms then infecting Chinese youth, ideas of not simply of science, but of democracy as well. So the concession to original concession of Hong Kong education to its environment was not entirely progressive. However, the potential was always there, and I'm particularly pleased that to see that your centre, or one of the members of your centre, has been instrumental in helping a couple of people, for example, to produce a basic reader in Buddhist Chinese, which so I've got it somewhere. This is the one that I'm talking about, and I see an acknowledgement in it, which is very heartening. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
You recognize it, yes.
Yeah, I have a copy.
Yes. So I'm very glad to see your name mentioned there, because this kind of thing is vital, that we need some native speakers of English who can come to grips with Buddhist Chinese. It's not easy, and we need more of them, and publications like this will help them to do that. And so I'm very glad to see that that you and your centre have had some input into this. There's a great potential there. What will happen in future, who knows? But it seems to me that the common understanding of which I spoke in my final sentence is something that where your Buddhist center can play a very important role, if possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Yeah. There is an
Yes.
feedback in the chat box from Yiwu.
Yes. Okay. In America, Buddhist studies is established, including East Asian Buddhist studies. This is partly a result of people like Stanley Weinstein and other pioneers, and it's because of the development of American meaning United States involvement in East Asia has been far greater than, especially after the Pacific War, far greater than British involvement ever was in China. As I pointed out in my second lecture, British interests have tended to focus on South Asia. So in America, you will find programs that will teach you to read Buddhist Chinese. In Britain, I don't know, Professor Daig in Cardiff has established, I think, Buddhist studies there with an East Asian dimension. Of course, in Oxford, there was Professor Dachetti, who unfortunately died suddenly at the start of the pandemic. I believe Oxford is moving towards a new appointment, but Professor Dachetti had a quite extraordinary command of both Buddhist Chinese and of the original Sanskrit and Gandhari, from which the translations were made. So we hope for the best for Oxford. SOAS has one scholar who is an expert on contemporary Chinese Buddhism. And of course, it's extremely important. The Buddhism is an important force throughout the Chinese world, and that's a topic that should be taught. But how teaching text translation will go, I'm not sure. I'm not involved in SOAS directly at the moment. Cambridge, excuse me, Cambridge would certainly welcome an expert in Chinese Buddhism. They have hoped to find funding to support such a post for some time, but they have been so far disappointed. Any Buddhist organization that feels called to help out there would certainly find a very receptive environment. I mean, for example, one of the scholars working in Chinese studies in Cambridge at the moment is Professor Galambos, who is an expert on Dunhuang materials. His particular interest is actually in codicological and other aspects of Dunhuang materials, which is very useful. It's sort of foundational in Dunhuang studies, but he would certainly welcome a colleague who could deal with the Buddhist content of a lot of the manuscripts he's dealing with. Edinburgh is now a well-established centre of Chinese studies, and one of the professors there has interests in Buddhism, but he also works in early China. So I'm not sure how much teaching about Buddhist Chinese texts he's able to do. So I certainly would hope to do what I can to promote Buddhist text translation in this country where I am now. I found it quite inspiring, actually, to see what had gone on at the Fintry Trust, that Alvin Langdon Coburn and his associates, they didn't have the support that is necessary, but looking through their vocabulary lists, laboriously copied out with the help of the Giles Dictionary, they wanted to do something. It was not for lack of trying that the work that they produce had some limitations. Let's hope for better things in future. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Any
Any other questions?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Timothy, for your fascinating talks. I think you brought in many different threads that to reflect on. A lot of this material, some of it's very new for me. But one thing that struck me is the resemblances that they saw between Roman Catholicism and Tibetan Buddhism, and how they try to attribute this to, Nestorian Christians or some Central Asian influence. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that, for example, I was reading Ippolito Desideri's account, in his years spent in Tibet, and he went at great pains to learn Tibetan, and he wrote even, treatises, theological treatises in Tibetan. And but nowhere, even though he spent so much time in Tibet, there is no account of history. And what strikes me here is that, Buddhism is before Christianity.
Yeah.
That should have been obvious to a lot of the Jesuits and a lot of the commentators. And yet they were so blinded, and they wanted to say, well, it must be that the Buddhists took it from the Christians. In other words, any resemblances that we see went that way. And at no moment there seemed to be a discourse, at least not with Ippolito. I don't know about the other figures that you mentioned. Some are completely new to me. But there doesn't seem to be a reflection on the historicity of the situation. And I'm wondering why their focus was so much theological, so much philosophical, and not historical in their treatment of the material.
Well, obviously,
so I don't know what you,
Yes, I can comment on that, but obviously not from the Tibetan point of view. But I do see a great weakness in historical understanding also in some of the missions to China. Ricci was clearly a very knowledgeable and capable individual. But he has some weak points, and sometimes coming out in his works. For example, he knows that China had been conquered by the Mongols. And of course, Genghis Khan was a figure that was well known from Marco Polo and so forth. But when he mentions this, he says it was conquered by some Tartar captain. He doesn't know who conquered China. I mean, part of the problem was that I don't know about Tibet, but China gained a reputation for extreme antiquity very early on. There was all this talk about Prisca Theologia and so forth that took the focus to very early China. That had two effects. One was to divert attention from history as such, to origins, and the other was to expose exactly how much history there was in between, and what a drag it would be to have to read all of it. One early Protestant missionary in the 19th century says, there's just too much Chinese history. Maybe we should translate a few historical novels. That would at least make it a bit more fun, So I think there are reasons. I wouldn't be able to speak about the Tibetan case, but there are reasons why history is ignored. Not totally, because obviously, Jesuits are industrious. Whatever one says about them, they do not lack for intelligence and diligence. And histories of China were produced in the 18th century, based on the kind of digests that Jushi and others produced of Chinese history. So that was done, but it is a weakness. And that's what I find interesting coming to it as a historian. Now, there are aspects of what I've been talking about, I am sure you noticed, where, for example, the point that Snellgrove was worried about, that a philological approach seems to ignore the fact that we are dealing with religious texts, for example. The historian, as it were, is a bystander in that particular face-off. But the historian, I think, the simplest thing historians can do is put everything in chronological order. And I think by doing that, you can bring out patterns which, as you say, raise questions about past approaches. And certainly, while I have talked a lot about translation here, one thing I've been trying to do, and in all these lectures, is to historicize translation and try and look at historical contexts as part of cultural contexts on both sides of any translation effort. So thank you very much. I hope you are stimulated to take this approach to, I mean, the materials that were produced by those early missions, were in some cases great achievements of that time. It's unfortunate that they were then neglected, for many decades thereafter, only rediscovered to some extent in the late 19th century in Italy and so forth. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Timothy. You actually inspired me to go back and look at the Ippolito Desiderio's writings. And, in lieu of your discussion and your talk, that's what I just realized. There is absolutely no mention of Tibetan history. Yeah. He spent, years in Tibet. He learned Tibetan. He became fluent. He could actually master very complex philosophical concepts. Yeah. And yet he didn't bother. It just strikes me so, he was a very educated man, there is no doubt, and a very clever man. And then at no point did he ask his informants, all those geshes and lamas that he was actually fraternizing with, about, well, how did Buddhism come to Tibet? And I don't know, I just find it very interesting, those times. And I think some of the figures you mentioned, of course, they're very erudite and they were quite learned, but their approach lacked that kind of historical inquiry into the matter. This is what I find just surprising.
Well, let me tell you that if you have that thought, nourish it, because let me be autobiographical here. I seem to be quite well known amongst my colleagues in America for something I said at a meeting of what must be AAR, one of those big religious studies associations, must have been. Most of my contemporaries, meaning people who are now in their early 70s, or some of them are no longer with us, like John McRae. Most of the people dealing with East Asian Buddhism in North America, they came to Buddhist studies through direct experience, things like the Vietnam War, for example. They took different routes. Sometimes it wasn't, oh, I was in the army, and when I got out, I went to the Zen center, which is what I've heard from some friends. Some, had, but different routes, but they were always to do with a personal involvement, trying to find out from Buddhism something relating to their situation. And I said, well, I'm in Buddhist studies because for the money. I was told that if I studied Buddhism, I would probably get a job. This was in Britain at a time when Weinstein had left and nobody was teaching East Asian Buddhism. And this was the historian Dennis Twitchett. He said, well, we had a Buddhist studies specialist, but he's gone to Yale. But if you go there and learn from him, you probably get a job back here. So I thought, it's not that I wasn't interested in Buddhism. Let me get you wrong. And also, you have probably found out already that studying Buddhism doesn't earn you much money. But you know, you can survive, and that's all that I wanted to do. So yes, but it's unusual, and I was unusual amongst that generation in not simply asking religious questions of my experience, but having studied with a historian, I was asking historical questions. And it seems to me, I'm not even doing what philologists do, and I think philologists can defend themselves against the Snellgroves. Linguistics certainly looks into the abilities of the human mind in a very profound way, and even the Roy Normans and so forth, who work with texts but don't engage. Well, he obviously he understood the ideas, but he didn't engage with them personally. That can be defended also in that, I mean, look, the discovery of Gandhari by these people has revolutionized our understanding of the value of early Chinese translations, and people like Paul Harrison have gone on to rethink important questions about Buddhism. By assign, I mean, they used to be thought of as primitive. Well, they're not infallible, but once you understand that they're based, is get the philological view of what language they're actually translating, then one can see the value of them. So I wouldn't underrate philology or linguistics either, but I think history has something it can contribute. That's what in a sense, what I've been trying to do in these lectures, to say, well, let's stand back a bit and take the historical view and what comes out, and I'm interested that it should raise questions for you, because that's what it was supposed to do. So I've had at least some success, and I'm glad I was forced to mention Tibet, because as you know, I know nothing about Tibet, but bringing it into this discussion, I'm glad that it's triggered some thoughts for you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you, Professor. There is one more question in the chat box asking about the difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism.
Is Tibetan Buddhism also Chinese Buddhism? Well, the simplest way to answer that is Tibetan Buddhism is expressed in the Tibetan language, and Chinese Buddhism is expressed in the Chinese language. So they're different because the languages are different. Now, obviously, that's not the end of the story, because obviously in the 1930s, people were translating from Tibetan into Chinese. And some very interesting work is being done in that kind of area by scholars like Esther Bianchi in Italy and so forth, and others. It's not that there is no overlap between Tibetan language Buddhism and Chinese language Buddhism. And also, of course, equally, if you look at the Dunhuang materials, you find a lot of translations of Chinese materials into Tibetan, early Chan materials, and that's being explored again by contemporary scholars. So they're different things because they're in different languages, but there are connections there, and they should be explored. Yeah, does that answer that one? Person in the chat box?
Yeah, thank you. So, any more questions? Any other questions from the floor?
Yes, I'm just curious, Timothy. Would
Yes.
your lectures appear in some form of publication that we can actually read them? Because they were very rich, and I frankly, I need to listen to them again. There was a lot of points you mentioned, but
Absolutely, I appreciate that. I need to tidy things up a bit, but there is a lot in the footnotes that could be helpful. There's also one publication that I realized I'd missed, meaning Goddard's original comments on Suzuki, which is in a book, which is scarcely more than 1 or 2 copies in Britain, but it's available on Amazon. So I've ordered it, but it won't come until February. So you're not going to get anything before the middle of February, but your head of department has suggested that it might be possible to sponsor the publication of these lectures.
oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah,
I look forward to it.
Well,
yeah. When you complete the manuscript, we can publish it here. Yeah. That's no.
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So we will wait for you.
Okay, well, as I say, I need to do a little bit more, but you will have the manuscript short. I mean, I could give you the rough version, but I think I'll try and tidy things up for you, and you can consider what to do with that. I'm very, very happy for your interest, because yes, I'm well aware that some of the information I'm presenting here touches upon details sometimes not widely known, based, for example, in the case of the Fintry Trust, on consulting archives that you won't learn about without seeing, the supporting materials on which my lectures have been based. Yeah.
Okay, so we all look forward to that then.
Thank you.
Okay, so any final questions? Okay, if no, then we would like to thank Professor Barrett again for your lecture today, and also for your very valuable sharing in the lecture series this time. We very much hope that there can be a chance for us to learn more from you in the future. We are, once again, very grateful to the MaMa Charitable Foundation for its generous support to make this lecture series possible. And thank you to you all for joining the lecture series this time. We hope to see you all again in our future events. Thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. Hope we see you in person. Yeah.
Bye, Timothy. Take care.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.